Hello and welcome everyone. We are excited to start today's November webinar, 1984, which is Managing with Big Brother. We've got some exciting topics to cover today. Before we get started though, I do want to go over our quick disclaimer here. Our information discussed in this session represents the views of individuals and does not constitute legal advice. Please make sure to always consult your organizational leadership and legal counsel. And with that, we'll get started. So my name is Brenda Stoltz, and I will be your moderator today. We've got three panelists that are going to cover some great content and talk to us a little bit about technology, the uses that we have for it today, how it can benefit your company, and how to make sure that it's a positive experience for your employees. I will be moderating the chat session, so if you have any questions, please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen to submit those, because we have muted everyone. Also, we will be recording this session and we'll make it available later today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and introduce you guys to the experts in the room. Really excited to have Dave, Olga, and Tom Ryan walk you guys through this. Not only do they have a vast amount of experience, but they also have a very diverse experience between the three of them. So I think it'll be a very value-added webinar.
Okay.
Dave?
All right, thanks, Brenda. Today's topic centers on George Orwell's novel, 1984. If you've ever had a chance to read it, it's very insightful. It was written quite a while ago. So we're going to go through that. We're going to look at Big Brother's oversight today. We're going to look at WMS and LMS selection strategies and how that can add information to your system. We'll look at the safety, security, and asset control tools that monitor everything today. Looking at BI tools, talking about BI tools and how you manage all this data, because the WMS, LMS, and all the asset control tools are going to give you a ton of information. And how do we boil that down? So then we can look at your leadership and how do we help the leadership manage with all this data and to manage on a more positive note. So those are the topics we want to take you through today. The 1984 novel was written by George Orwell in 1949. Very grim, futuristic novel about a dystopian society where the inhabitants lived under constant surveillance. They had telescreens, which were two-way communication devices that were everywhere. And he developed the character Big Brother was, and Big Brother was always watching. So interesting setting that it created, and when 1984 came, we did see some of that. We're in 2021 now, soon to be 2022, and the surveillance opportunities are all over the place. So where are we today? In a modern warehouse, your every move can be tracked. Who did what, when, how long, and with what are questions that we need answers to safely, effectively, and profitably manage our operation. And lastly, how do we make this all a positive experience for the employees? As you can see, it's, the information comes from all these places and needs to get into a central location. So Tom, talk to us about some warehouse and labor management systems and how that can support the data and give us the information we need.
Well, warehouse management systems have been with us for, decades. And as a part of what they do, they give instructions to individuals to go execute work, especially if you're using handheld devices. And they also have the ability to track that, save that, retain that. You think of it as a transaction log. And they have something similar, although not as precise, if you will, or in depth when someone is using a screen to interact with the system. The net result of this is, as they've started this thing out with, in the warehouse, generally speaking, you know what everybody is doing. And in fact, you may have assigned them that work. And that opens up the door to being able to compare their work against a standard. So when you look at the WMS, it's the data collector. And it's the system that is providing you that detailed level of information about the operators and the people that are using the system. It also has the ability to do some standard reporting, filter, sort some of the data, and some of them have the ability to compare to a kind of like a fixed standard. But generally speaking, think of the WMS as the data collector, not the analyzer. And for example, on this context, when I had a client once that was talking about one of his operators was routinely putting stuff away in the wrong spot. And that operator drove a very narrow aisle truck, turret truck, in the vintage of that truck. Once it entered the very narrow aisle, it couldn't rotate the forks to the other side. And so when confronting the operator, why are you keep continuing to put this stuff away in the wrong spot? That seems to indicate that you're entering the aisle with your forks pointed in the wrong direction. And the operator tried to hedge on the questions. And the guy says, well, look, at 2:47 yesterday afternoon, you did it. And then again at 4:56 yesterday afternoon, you did it. So you know you're doing it. And it's simple. Just think about it before you go in. The reason he was able to do that was the system was recording the fact that the operator overrode the assigned put away location. Well, when you begin to, that's a confrontation, if you will, on a personal basis, on a performance basis, on a sticking to standard behavior procedure basis. When you look at labor management systems, they add a whole nother level of management analysis and assessment of capability, assessment of performance. There's essentially two flavors of the labor management system, LMS, that we can think about. One, call it LMS Lite. And in LMS Lite, many of the mainstream WMSs have LMS Lite tacked on as an optional module, often sold optionally, on top of their WMS. And what LMS Lite does is it gives you the ability to do some simple analytics, some simple comparison to a set standard. And so that standard would be, let's just say, each picks per hour, pallet moves per hour, simple things like that, where you set a standard and you can compare people's behavior and performance against that standard. When you get into the more functionally complete LMSs, call it LMS heavy or LMS full function, it's allowing you to deal with an engineered standard. So this is where you begin to take into consideration, it's not just a put away, but this put away started on the farthest corner of the receiving dock and had to go to the farthest corner of the pallet rack. There was travel time, there was congestion. Therefore, there should be a factor associated with giving the operator a more time to complete the task because of the situation that existed at the time the task was assigned. Call those engineered standards. They can also report back on what is happening and compare that and give you some analysis that would help you set what you want your performance thresholds to be. Simply said, that it gives you more capability to do it. Now, the reality is most of these most customers that are using WMS and a WMS that has WMS Lite, it covers a lot of capabilities for most people. And often that's a good way to start your implementation or start your selection. The full-blown LMSs are typically a third party as opposed to built into an existing warehouse management system solution. So you can often add those later. Question was asked, is there a difference in the data or the information? The reality is not a difference in the data or the information. Remember, the WMS is the thing capturing the information. The LMS gives you a level of analysis and assessment that the WMSs typically don't have, but it's all working on the same data. Now, LMSs may add a few data streams that the WMS doesn't have. For example, it may integrate with your time and attendance system and be able to capture, that people, Fred checks in. It seems to take him 25 minutes before he really starts doing work. Well, 20 minutes of that was a team meeting, so maybe that's okay. But in the last half hour before break or before lunch, he seems to slow down. You would see that kind of stuff more easily using an LMS. So when you go looking in a selection process, for example, for warehouse or labor management systems, you need to be thinking about what you want to use it for and when do you might want to do that. Dave, I think I'll hand it back over to you after that.
All right, your comment about the the gentleman who was doing the moves reminded me of what I had found once, and it was in a building, a smaller square foot building, very high volume, and they did allow moves. The lift operator could make their own moves as products started selecting. They could move stuff closer to the pick slot. I did see this one gentleman though who was making more moves than anybody else. And when I got into the detail and looked at the building, every time they went on break, every time they went to the bathroom, they had to move to that section of the building so they could get the travel time covered. And then they moved it back. So when I pointed out to the GM, he was a little embarrassed. And it just shows you what kind of data is out there that you can capture bad behaviors and correct them before they go really sour.
Now, Tom, you mentioned that, before they go into a selection. Yeah, I was going to ask Tom. Yeah, I was going to ask Tom. So you mentioned, right, before you do a selection for the WMS or LMS, you really have to consider what you need it for. They're both an investment. Is there a time where you would recommend to only start with a WMS, or when do you think it's time to really add the LMS component in a warehouse?
I would think that if you're looking at a WMS, a replacement or a new WMS, and you've not really had a performance-based assessment process or procedure in place, that you go for the WMS, you think about using LMS Lite, you bring the WMS live, run it for 4 or 5, 6 months, using it to collect data. And then based on that data, you have a good opportunity to set realistic standards for when you then, as a second phase or a third phase, add in the LMS Lite. And then depending on the nature of your business, you may need to go to the full LMS full richness. But again, most of the time that's a third-party solution as opposed to built into the WMSs. So it could be a follow-on project. Does that answer your question, Brenda?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Video surveillance. You see it everywhere, and a lot of it's brought in initially to look at, excessive damage, any theft. It's really, it took a life of its own when it came in, right? Injuries, accidents, excessive damage are near impossible to investigate without witnesses. Video has become that witness. A lot of it came in, as I said, for theft deterrent and the SNAP. I think a lot of companies have realized on the accident front, on the injury front, it's more than paid for itself to help understand and dispute claims that were not right, and to support the claims that there were a problem. It goes both ways. Those systems are very expensive. They require maintenance. So really understanding what you're really going to get back out of it, look at all the angles. The placement and recording options are really critical to its ROI. Site and IS security, more so nowadays, controlling who comes on the premise and when is critical to the security and safety of the company. There are some systems that if you're only scheduled for the morning shift, you're only allowed on premise during the morning. Your card won't work after hours. Knowing when you came in, when you left, not only for the safety of the company if you're not supposed to be there, but the safety of you in case there's some type of evacuation need in the building, that we know who is in the building. So that is good. That's a really good time when that information helps. On the IS front, go ahead.
I was going to say, so David, you're reminding me of an opportunity or a time where I was doing a project on a facility that was involved in processing some very hazardous and dangerous stuff. And the access card was really a tracking tool for people moving through the facility. You basically waved your card wherever, into almost every section that you moved into. You would be, scanning that I moved into this room, scanning that I moved into that part of the building, and so forth. And I do remember they routinely had alerts and alarms. And as you would the alarms would go off, people would go to the assembly area and there was a scanner there. And then they would scan themselves into the assembly area. And then the management staff could know very quickly who was not there and where were they last seen, what part of the building they were last in.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's, yeah, it's amazing what the site security can do. And minimizing the risk of hackers gaining access to the system, it's a business continuity and risk avoidance strategy more and more these days. And there's all these reports of the hackers. So the IS getting tough on, who's allowed in the system. I've had, working with different clients, it took me 4 hours to get into a protected site one day, doing it the right way, just because there were so many layers that my laptop wasn't jiving with their laptop. So a lot of companies are taking great strides to really limit who can see what and when. Talking about asset control, in a warehouse, a lot of expensive material handling equipment, from double jacks to lifts, outreach lifts. And then there's more electronics. All those material has electronics on them. And then all the individual, the more, as Tom said, the more handhelds, there's more scanners out there. It's a lot of money, going into play to buy all this equipment. And how do we keep it safe? How do we know who's going to, who's been damaging it? I've seen asset control lockers that are just basically glorified vending machines. The headsets are kept in there, and you just scan your card in to get what you need. You're not certain, you're only a picker. You're only allowed to get the handset. You're not allowed to get the truck mount attachments. There's a lot of controls there, and you have to turn it back. That serial number has been signed out to you. Those are some really good stuff. If you have a large workforce with a lot of electronics in it, definitely look at something like that would help control the damage. MHE account.
Dave, back in the height of the RFID mania that was going on for a while, did a couple projects where asset tracking and asset management was important. And in one of those, it was in a hospital, and they had expensive pieces of equipment that would roll around and could be in different places and not always end up back in their staging zone or their location area where they could be then used again. And so we put a ultrasound asset instead of RFID. They didn't like all the radio waves floating around inside a hospital, but we used ultrasound techniques and attached that to the equipment. And then the readers could tell them where the equipment was. They then took it and matched it up with, if the equipment is in a room, who is the patient that's in the room, and should the patient be getting charged for that equipment because it's in their room, therefore it must be getting used by them. It was an interesting project, to say the least.
It sounds it.
I think another thing to note here from an asset control perspective, although, adding some of these tools that really helps you track and know exactly when is and who is using these assets might be a cost up front, but I think ultimately it may help you minimize some of the cost because you're not buying excess assets, right? You're really only buying what you need. And then you're making sure helping everyone take care of it. And so the cost associated with repairing might also be something that a company takes into consideration.
Oh, absolutely. And also I'd say if you don't have a locker of sort and you're having somebody man a booth to sign it out and sign it back in, you have at least 2 shifts worth of hours, labor costs as well. So there's a lot of things to take into account. Yes, the price tag of it itself is large, but there's a lot of payoffs. So we've talked about data. We talked about a lot of data. The WMS data that Tom talked about, the LMS data that Tom talked about, that's some tremendous stuff. It doesn't live long in those environments, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month. So if you want to look over time, how are we doing? We need a good place to put that. And a BI tool, business intelligence tool, can really help that. You can collect the data and put it into one place. You can get to the data that really matters when you start looking at the gaps in the process. Where are the productivity lapses? Do we have inefficient picking bins? You can also pinpoint the time and location for investigations. I've used it in the past, looking at, Tom's mentioned before about break time. You can watch somebody's travels throughout the day on all their assignments, and you start seeing the gaps come up, and you can talk to them instead of like, hey, you were really slow today. You can narrow in on a specific time that between these hours you slow down. What was going on? You can get more into a coaching and helping as opposed to punishing because you're not making your standards. So I think this is one of the areas that you can really look at, to help remove some of the soft costs. Because if you look at the labor implications, if we can improve productivity, really over time, that's less labor we need because we're doing more with less. And that just starts to, rolling into, the labor, hiring costs, training costs, if we can make people feel better about their jobs and not beating them up all the time, we're going to have less turnover. All of that's some really positive messages. Different intelligence tools out there can give you some dashboard reporting, where you can have on screens that, what's our production status, what's our order status. If you have multiple streams hitting your shipping dock at the same time, where are the bottlenecks? How many units per hour are we doing, and what's the individual performance? And key components also, any deep dive analytics. How easy it is to do the data retrieval and export it out to a spreadsheet. Can a supervisor with limited IT experience do that? And that really helps when they can sit down, get their data, dive into it, and understand where the problems are. So it's it's really self-managing.
Dave, what I would add here as well is that this type of information over, a long period of time can really help leaders leverage it to also recognize and look for those opportunities to bring positive messaging to the team, either around strong performance or, productivity gains over time, which I think can go a long way when we think about employee engagement as well.
Absolutely.
When you look at the labor management tools, when they first came out, to your point, Brenda, when they first came out, they were predominantly focused in the grocery distribution center type environment. That was where the initial market fit tended to be sweetest, if you will, in terms of a sweet spot. And what was driving that was trying to get more and more productivity out of what is a very complex picking and shipping environment. The distribution centers of grocery companies that are feeding grocery stores. And so it was used to put in place engineered standards and things like that. And a lot of these environments were unionized. And there was great trepidation on the union's part about these tools coming in. And they fought it. But then over time, they began to recognize that, wait a minute, the tool is an impartial arbitrator with regard to what we've done and what our people have done. Are we being managed to the standards we agreed to in our contracts and things like that? So then it gained a lot of acceptance. But the other negative, and it comes back to how do you use these tools in such a way as to build your business and not and not just slide, was that in some environments, first and second level management just kind of stopped coaching, stopped managing, and just used the numbers, as Dave has talked about a couple times, to beat on people. And that was the backlash negative. So you've got to be careful about how you sell this, how you use this, and not fall into some of the easy traps that have been experienced in the past.
Right, and that's what's given it the negative connotations, the big brother watching. So Olga, can you take us through some of your experience and how do you make this a positive
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think we can all agree that the use of these systems and technologies in our warehouses can really help drive optimal performance. But, you know, to Tom's earlier points, it really comes down to the approach your leadership team takes when either looking to implement a new system or process or leveraging an existing one can make all of the difference in terms of the benefits that you really gain. So, for example, we have seen or all heard of situations where employees have perceived this productivity monitoring as a very robotic and sort of intrusive way to manage employees. And it's created such a dissatisfaction in some employee bases that they have come together and have publicly shared their concerns through the media about the way that their company is leveraging this data or this productivity information and the expectations that they're setting on them. And, you know, it really escalates at times to a point where they feel like they need a third party to come and represent them because they feel like their leadership team is really not hearing them and treating them, you know, as people. And so I would say this is definitely not the outcome that we want. And so as you think about either implementing a new technology or a workplace monitoring or surveillance solution, or you're looking to leverage an existing one, you really have to come together with your leadership team and have a clear approach as to how this information will be leveraged. What is your philosophy around how to ensure that the leaders use this appropriately, all and with the objective of not just driving performance and productivity, but also that employee engagement. And so a lot of this really comes down to how do you communicate with honesty and transparency? So as an example, you know, what I know I have seen done in previous organizations is how do you integrate into your existing processes or communications, for example, your employee orientation or your training processes? How do you integrate communication that really sets clear expectations with your employees around here is the data, the surveillance, the monitoring that we have. Here is why we have it and the benefits that it brings you. Here's the access that you will be able to see. Here's what your leaders will be able to see. But more importantly, like, what are they doing with that information? And so, you know, from a leadership perspective, as you think about performance, we really encourage leaders to look at that information and that data and use it to help identify either a training gap or a process gap, that then they take that data as a starting point to an engaging conversation and a positive interaction with an employee to really help them understand here's where you are. And hopefully when we say transparency, that employee already knows, right, where they stand against the standard because you've had that transparency. So you're really just starting a conversation to help figure out how do you remove obstacles for this employee to help them improve. And I think that really integrating and instilling this type of communication can make all of the difference in how positive of an experience it creates, but, you know, more importantly, allowing you to effectively drive that performance throughout the warehouse.
I think you're spot on, especially on the communication and, you know, the messaging that it's all coming the same from all levels, from the supervisor, from the night shift supervisor to the CEO. They're all talking the same same message of the honesty and transparency. That is a big selling point.
No, I agree. You know, I think, Olga, you hit it right on the dot, right? I think it's really about how do the leaders first come together to form a strategy and understand how this is going to be a change, right? So we work with a lot of clients when they're adding a WMS, we're going through an implementation or an LMS implementation, and we help with what we call like client-side responsibilities, right? And part of that is helping them to really strategically think through that change and figure out what are the steps going to look like in order to get their team prepared for it, in order to communicate it, and in order for it to really be a positive change for everyone, right? So I think that that's key right there, is ensuring that we don't get too focused on the tools and the awesome things that it's going to do for performance in the business, but also look at how we're going to positively impact the engagement of those employees.
That's a very good point, Brenda. Thank you. So to summarize, we went over a lot of stuff real quick. I realize that, but there's so many different software and hardware vendors out there with a lot of different tools. We discussed the different programs that can track the activities. We talked about the tools that can make sense of it. It really comes down to how you manage the data, how your leaders use this information, influence your employees' perspective. Are they playing gotcha, or do they really want to help me succeed? You really want the latter. You want them to feel that they're using all this data to help me get better and to do a better job. That's really how this whole big brother thing needs to turn around in today's environment. So, question and answers.
We do have one. So, you guys covered a lot of just systems and tools. What is your recommendation if a company just isn't sure of where to start, right? What kind of tools they should be adding to kind of monitor and really maximize the performance of their teams?
It's, I know Tom can add on to it, but you really need to it's a great question. Where do you start? You really need to start by understanding your current business practices. Where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years? What do you want to be doing? What's your volume? There are so many vendors. You could pick one area and have 5 different vendors. Only one might work for your needs. And finding that one the first time is going to save you a lot of money. But on Tom, if you want to piggyback on that.
Well, I was going to actually back up a little bit further. So let's say that you're in an environment where you may not have been doing any kind of performance-based analysis or reporting or maintaining performance to a standard or things like that. So you don't necessarily have to start with a tool. And a lot of companies already have key factors, key performance indicators that they're tracking via other means. And, a lot of the warehouses I visit, you'll see these things posted on bulletin boards, paper copies, graphs and stuff like that. And so you could sit back and say, what do we think as business management of our facility are the key factors, the key performance indicators that we think we want to track? And then how can we begin the process of tracking them today? And because part of the game is instituting and transitioning people to having this be a part of how they're evaluated, a part of how they're judged. And so you could begin to incorporate them in the process of validating what is doable with what you have, and what are effective standards with what you have, and gaining their input to it, and then post the results. And it is very interesting to watch where some companies will have large display monitors showing results on the shift, the orders that we got to pick today, how many orders we've done, how did second shift do last night, how did third shift do this morning, and seeing that kind of result. And it puts a certain amount of peer pressure and competitiveness to it all. At the same time, it generates understanding and feedback, sometimes blowback. But it helps you tailor it. And then you can sit back and say, what is it that I want my tool to do? What else is it that the tool can do that I can't do today? And then you can find out what your requirements are as you go about your search for the next level of capability and using Big Brother to help manage your business.
Yeah, and to that point, you could also look at what behavior are you trying to change? There's bad behavior, there's some gaps out there. Do you need the shock it type MHE equipment, which any type of impact stops the equipment, or do you need to go out and just get some paint and repaint all the machines and check for paint scrapes when they bring them back? There's probably somewhere in between most companies will go to. But
yes.
Thank you both. I think that is very helpful. And I will add that, obviously Alpine, this is what we do. We typically come in and start with a best practice assessment. And this is absolutely something that a company can do internally. And it's really, to Tom's point, just looking at your overall performance and really assessing where is your company stand as far as best practices and best in class measures, and really start there and focus on what is the potential improvement that you can make, and then what is the ROI before you start investing in a lot of different tools and technology. And so if anyone is interested, we'd love to help you with that. Please reach out. Oh, we have one more question. I was going to close it out, but question is, how do you gain agreement and decide on 1 or 2 key metrics?
That's a good question. And the first my question back is, who's really in charge of these metrics? What drives the most business? How does it, if you look at your supply chain, your value stream, what's the voice of the customer, the voice of the business? Where is my most of my money? I almost do like a loss analysis. If I'm looking at units per hour going out the door, what's the cost of my units per hour? And is that larger than my safety? What's my OSHA payout? It really, you have to, it's a loss analysis, and then finding the one that's going to impact the bottom line the quickest and narrow it down that way. I would start with a loss analysis.
I would also look at it from a perspective of, what is it that people really don't like doing? Is it something that by putting a performance indicator against it, you can help them do better at it? Or is it something where you can collect the data and get their involvement and understanding why it takes so long, or why is it so difficult, which they can help fuel a game plan for how do we make this problem area go away. I was involved once upon a time in an environment where we were doing Deming, black belt kind of stuff, and we talked about it in the context of we're a boat floating down the river, and we want to lower the level of the river so that we can see where the rocks are at. Change the game, improve, enhance the, increase the throughput required, lower the level of the river, and then find your rocks, raise the level back up so you can continue doing the business. But now you know where the rock is, so you go remove the rock so it's then safer and more functionally capable to lower the river again and keep it there. And then repeat, rinse and repeat. Now let's lower the river a little more, find the next rock, take that rock out, and be able to continue forward. I think that's a way where you get people's involvement in identification of the problem and identification of the potential solution.
Right. Good. Okay, if there's not any other questions, we thank you for your time. As Brenda said, this is stuff that we do at Alpine. So, if you have any other questions, please reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to get you answers.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.